All right, well, some people might trickle in or whatever. Yeah, thanks for coming. Hopefully my passion will be something that you can learn a few things from. My name is Reverend Dr. Pete Jerkin. That's my family. No awes or anything. Anyway, that's me and my wife and our 5 children. The pandemic gave us all sorts of wonderful gifts, including a surprise child. But that is wonderful. She's a total blessing to us. I'm an editor of Bible resources, technically, I think, at Concordia Publishing House. My main duties are actually to be a developer of things. So I worked on curriculum, some of the confirmation material, Sunday school, day school, and then I'm working on a variety of other things. Before coming to Concordia Publishing House, I just celebrated my 5th year at CPH. I was a parish pastor in 2 different settings, an associate pastor in Des Moines, Iowa, and then another in Columbus, Nebraska. And I can honestly say that the trajectory that took me from parish life to CPH was not something I would have ever planned. That was not something I desired to do, to leave the parish. But there were opportunities to maybe help support the church. And ideally, hopefully, presentations like this will help support you in your different ministries, especially as you're thinking through how to teach adults. And that's my passion. I have a doctorate in instructional leadership with a focus on andragogy. That'll be the particular field of study, the approach to teaching adults that we'll be talking about some today. I also have a master's in education and my MDiv. So I enjoy helping to equip people with tools to teach the faith. So as we get going, here's actually opening discussion. I apologize if you're the kind of people that don't like to be interactive with each other during presentations. I know we just got done with lunch and all sorts of different sitting down presentations and things. I do challenge you guys here to do some sharing. And there's a reason for I want you guys to do some sharing with each other in this session. And it's not just because I want to get out of leading, but actually that one of the assumptions of andragogy we're talking about is the role of experience. And you guys have experience. You know your contexts, you know your settings, you guys come with a wealth of experience, you're adult learners. So I want to help facilitate opportunities for you guys not only to learn new things, but to share what you know with each other and learn from each other. And that is actually a major part of adult learning. So the first question I want you guys to reflect on, I'll give you guys a second, just kind of think through in your minds and then share with 1 or 2 people. I'm not going to dock you any grades for doing 2 or 3 people, but in whatever kind of groups naturally arise, I want you to think, in your experience, what are the biggest differences between how you learned as a child and how you learn today as an adult? What are the biggest factors in those differences? So what are the biggest differences between how you learned as a child and how you learn today as an adult? Just going to give you a second just to think on your own. Okay. So to turn to a partner or a group of 3, find some people around you, introduce yourselves, say hi, where you're from, you're all adults, and share your experiences. Go for it.
Enthusiastic.
Huh? Oh, find wherever. Yeah, but right now they're just kind of sharing their reflections. So if you can introduce yourself to a group or something, you can butt in. Yes, I can get you one.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Where the fears go, yeah. I just walked in.
There's a handout if you want to grab one. Oh, right there. Just kind of sharing, so if you can sit down somewhere and introduce yourself.
I think a lot of times
For me, I think as a parent, a lot of it's out of the way.
Let's give you guys another minute or so to make sure everyone gets a chance to talk. But if you're all done, just keep on sharing. You're adults. You can keep talking with each other. Okay. All right. I know some are talking, some are done talking. We'll have you guys kind of share in a little bit at different times. I appreciate your willingness to talk and share your experiences. Would anyone be willing to share a point or two that you overheard just with the large group? Yeah.
I think kind of a sum of our discussion is, as an adult, it becomes much more experientially based. Like, knowledge doesn't matter as much as knowledge that is useful. Right? Whereas a kid, you learn all this stuff because someone told you it was
Yeah. Yeah, no, good. Thank you. These things are themes that will come up, but it is really interesting, isn't it? Sitting here as adult learners in this space, surrounded by what, are all good things, but things that probably remind you of a previous time, and you're not there right now. And I'm going to challenge you guys, if we're teaching adults matters of the faith, and this is what we're used to. When we think of education, and our adult learners think of education, and this is what they think of, and this is how you're treating them, how do you think they're going to respond? Yeah, I know, I see some shaking heads, but a lot of this is unconscious. We tend to teach the way we're taught, right? And sometimes that unintentionally comes out. What are some other things? Yeah.
Dr. Jerkin, I self-select into my own learning.
Yes, you self-select into your own learning.
Yeah, nobody tells me what I have to learn unless it's HR that says I have to watch the video on how not to click a bad link on an email or something.
Right. And as an adult learner who is forced to watch an or HR presentation on how not to open phishing emails, how do you approach that?
Just do it.
You do it because you have to.
and you might be irritated about it.
Yes.
I'm irritated about it, but I also have a job at the end of the day. Right? So.
But you do it because you have to, and you wouldn't necessarily choose to do that. Yeah. Someone else had a hand up? So, thank you. So you self-select? Yeah.
I think a lot of learning as an adult is a lot more self-taught. So you're gathering resources and sort of teaching yourself as opposed to you're the teacher and you're going to sit and listen.
Yeah. Your concept of self is probably going to be very different as a self-directed learner, right? You tend to think of yourself that way, right? I've got the tools, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn, I'm going to gather what I need to, I'm going to ask if I think I need help, but most of the time I can find it out on my own. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and you know, in the traditional way you're educated, you have no control, and it's not always participatory. You know, it's the teacher's teaching and you're learning. And maybe some adults like that, but that's not what I'm looking for.
Yeah, maybe some adults really like that direct instruction. And direct instruction is still a very valuable way to teach for all ages, but I think as you get older, if you're going to be in a lecture, you know, you really want to be there because you're interested in that thing, and you might just sit through that lecture. Yeah. Huh?
I wonder whether, you know, I'm in my 60s, things haven't changed. When you say we learn directly, I'm much more likely to go to the internet today and say, how do I do this?
Yes.
I'm just going to YouTube, Google stuff, or, you know, which is different than what I did 20 years ago.
Right.
Then I was more, I might have to ask somebody, right? Now I just go to YouTube.
You do YouTube, and you need to finish a basement. What do? You go to YouTube,
Right.
and you find videos on someone figured out how to do this part, right? Yeah. In back?
We didn't say this in our group, but I was just thinking as you guys were talking, I'm a lot more critical, you know, of what I'm learning. I'm evaluating a lot more than as a child. As a child, you take what people tell you, you're supposed to take it. And then as you get older, you evaluate what you're doing.
Yeah, I heard that. You tend to be much more critical, you know, not take things for granted, right? Maybe jaded or cynical or something, but I think a lot just has to do with the approach to learning. Okay, I mean, we could probably talk and share. Yeah.
I think this is probably what you've already said, but motivation changes between being a child and an adult.
Yeah.
An adult, you seek things that you need to know or want to know, and faith might be part of that or should be part of that. So I think it's all a matter of if you can gather adults together and involve them in this motivational process. To me, that's a major part of the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, motivation. And motivation can't just be, well, you know, I'm going to give you a grade, right? Especially in matters of like faith. Like, if you don't come to Bible class, I'm going to give you an F. Has that ever worked, you know? Probably not. And if it does work for you, please let me know how that works for you, because that's kind of bizarre. So a lot of the things you guys have been talking about are going to be apparent. They're going to be, you know, readily understood in this andragogical framework that I'm going to talk about. But hopefully you will see as, you know, we talk about this and as you interact with each other and you listen and we kind of do this participatory stuff. A lot of these things are just very common sense. Very common sense, and we know it in our bones, but how do we use it? And how do we think about how we use that to teach the faith and teach in our contexts, right? We're adults. How we teach matters, especially when we're teaching adults. So again, the area that I was trained in, it's one philosophy of adult education, andragogy or andragogy. I'm not sure exactly how you're supposed to pronounce it. It has one of the most unfortunate names ever because it doesn't make any sense. But it's the art and science of teaching adults. And there are different educational theories out there. There's Jack Mesereau, there's transformational stuff. David Kolb has different ideas about learning styles and that sort of thing. But andragogy was espoused mostly by a guy by the name of Malcolm Knowles. He had a primary focus in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s of trying to kind of find a way to approach teaching adults in a simple way, a simple set of assumptions, and his main focus was on non-formal settings, right? So outside of college classrooms. And guess what? In the faith, we're probably not focused on college classrooms. So things like HR and continuing education, that sort of thing, voluntary. Yeah?
What was this guy's name?
Malcolm Knowles. I think it's Knowles. Yep. And I challenge you guys, if you're looking for a decent summary, Malcolm Knowles' The Adult Learner is his kind of book. There's a million different editions out there. You can jump on Amazon and get a used copy of like an edition from the last 20 years for $7 or something like that. And I challenge you to do that because he went through and he summarized a lot of different adult learning theories. But the idea behind andragogy, why it would have this weird name, is that he wanted to establish an alternative set of assumptions that we use when teaching adults as opposed to pedagogy. And you've heard the word pedagogy, right? And when we think of the word pedagogy, we usually think just the art and science of teaching. But pedagogy actually means the art and science essentially of leading children. And so by coming up with a name like andragogy, andro meaning man, like the art and science of teaching adults, grown-ups. And just to say, look, there are differences. There are differences to how adults learn and how children learn, and he refined these over time and came up with different changes over time because he was a practical guy. But essentially, the thing that we need to think about, the main difference between pedagogy and andragogy is the kind of learner that we have. Pedagogy, when we're thinking the pedagogical assumptions, the typical traditional way we think of teaching children, is that we're dealing with more or less dependent learners. People that need the teacher to give them the information, right? Where andragogy assumes that the learners you have are more independent. They don't need you as much as children need you as the leader. People have a different way of looking at themselves. And here's what's really great about Malcolm Knowles and his approach, is that when he began, again, this was an ever-changing set of assumptions. He's dead now, but when he began, he kind of thought of the pedagogy and andragogy as these binary things. It's either one or the other. Use one approach or another approach, and all adults learn this way and all children learn this way. But over time, he kind of softened on that, and he said, think of it as a continuum. And this is one of the things I'm not sure we always do when we're teaching any group of people, is think of where you are on this continuum of being more of a dependent learner. Someone's more dependent on the teacher and more of an independent learner. Because the reality is, does anyone here work with youth, like high school youth, right? I mean, youth are a huge challenge because you have some youth that are really dependent, socially mature, that sort of thing, and some youth that are like older than they should be, and they're used to being on their own. And so that's one of the challenges, I think, of dealing with youth in like a church context is where are they? Are they more dependent on you? Should you use more of a pedagogical approach, or are they more independent and you use a more andragogical approach, right? But when you go into a learning environment, and we'll contrast these two approaches, right? When you go into any environment and you're thinking about your learners and the people that you have in front of you, think about where they are. What kind of things should you assume about them as learners? And how should you go about constructing your lessons for them? And the same goes for adults too. You could have some adults that are very dependent. You think of, say, like as a pastor, in an adult information course, we have some people who are very insecure and they don't really know much, and they just want to sit there and they want you to talk at them and you write down notes, and fill in the blanks. That might be an approach that some adults really like, right? But you got to know your people. And that's what makes some mixed groups rather challenging, but I think there's some things that you can do to mitigate that. So, one thing that Malcolm Knowles did, and this is on your handout, one thing Malcolm Knowles did is he wanted to make this andragogical system memorable and simple. And so what he came up with over the decades of his study was essentially 6 different assumptions. When you're using an andragogical approach, 6 things you should assume about the adult learner that make them different than many children or youth. And again, since this is best practices, I figured for the sake of this particular session, if you don't learn anything from this, try to remember these 6 different assumptions and think about how they might be useful for you when you're teaching adults. And the 6 assumptions are need to know, motivation of the learner, self-concept, readiness to learn, role of experience, and orientation to learning. And keep these things in mind. Hopefully, you'll have a better understanding of how to teach the adults in front of you. So on your sheet, you have these, the adult learning theory, 1 through 6. I'll give you a second to go over these and in your groups kind of think about what sticks out to you. But I'll give just a brief rundown of each one of these 6 assumptions. First of all, need to know. And the assumption with this is that adult learners need to know why they need to learn something before undertaking to learn it. And remember, we're thinking about contrasting this to how we have generally stereotypically taught children. You don't have to agree with these, it's just the theory, right? But they need to know why they need to learn something before undertaking to learn it. Now, there are some adults that would really like, and they'll show up to any Bible class the pastor does, right? Just because it's there. And that's their own motivation. Those are very few. They're getting older. And they'll just show up to whatever. But there's a lot of adults also say, we're going to be studying the book of Mark for the next who knows how long.
Why?
Why? What's a mark? Right? So this does not mean that you need to change what you're studying, but, well, let's learn about the life of Jesus Christ and what that means for us. Just happen to be going through the book of Mark, right? So you need to know why they need to learn something before undertaking to learn it. They don't just necessarily assume that since you're the expert, they need what you're teaching. Motivation to learn. This kind of comes to some of the motivation stuff. The assumption goes that adult learners are responsive to some external motivators, like better jobs, promotions, higher salaries, and the like. But the most potent motivators are internal pressures. The internal pressures like job satisfaction, self-esteem, quality of life, and the like. So before, we can motivate kids in a classroom because they have to be there with A's and stars and treats. But generally speaking, when you're tapping into the adult motivation to learn, there needs to be something more internal. There could be some internal drive of why they need to know this. 3, self-concept. Adult learners have a self-concept of being responsible for their own decisions, for their own lives. And this is one of these things that we were talking about before when it came to, I can pick and choose what I want to learn, right? And that's, I think when it comes down to it, there are some of these that are really powerful things. Think about the self-concept. I'm here because I choose to be. I want to learn this. I'm responsible for my own learning. How can you really mess this up? Well, when you have, say, like in a Bible class or a small group, and you have a leader that's talking, and someone who never raises their hand, ever, and wants to talk. That one lady, Grandma Schmidt in the back, finally raises her hand because she doesn't really want to talk, but she has this finally mustered up the motivation to talk, and she wants to share something, and the pastor, the other small group leader, listens and just says, no, that's not right. She doesn't have to be there. Chances are Grandma Schmidt will vote with her feet. Or she might go and say something really bad about you to someone else, and that'll cause a whole lot of problem, right? So you got to honor their self-concept. I mean, you guys are here at Best Practices because you want to learn. You want to be part of this great big party, and there's a little bit of pressure from me up here to give you something that you can use. Because I trust you guys are self-motivated learners. And you're here because there's something you need to deal with. Which leads us to the next few here. Readiness to learn. This assumption says that adult learners become ready to learn those things they need to know and be able to do in order to cope effectively with real-life situations. And again, this is a caricature. Do you ever have those math class in junior high? Why do I need to learn this? You'll use it someday, right? Can you imagine saying that in like a Bible class or something like that? They had the Guinness Maiestaticum. Why do I need to learn this? You'll use it someday. They'll say, no, we won't. We're out of here, right? But instead, what tends to motivate adults? Their roles in life. When you're a kid, your primary role or vocation in life is being a student. Maybe not for all. There are some who, again, are thrust into much older type situations. They need to take care of their families and things like that. That becomes their primary factor, and being a student does not. But for many, in our experience anyway, as a kid, your main role in life is being a student. When you're an adult, it's not. You got a worker, you're a neighbor, you're a husband or wife, you're a parent. You're part of the society. So these are the things that motivate you, right? Role of experience, number 5. The assumption says that adult learners come into an educational activity with both a greater volume and a different quality of experience from that of youths. And this might seem like an obvious thing, but think about it. as part of my dissertation work, I went around and I sat in on different Bible studies and just observed what was happening in a Bible study, which was kind of weird for a while, but hey, it was 9 months of my life sitting in Bible studies on Sunday, paying attention. I can tell you almost every single one was a pastor standing up front, leading the Bible study. He'd be up there talking about a doctrinal topic or something like that, and like halfway through, you're going to have someone who raises their hand, and the thing that comes out of their mouth has nothing to do with what the pastor's talking about. They want to share an experience. Well, this happened to me. I have this going on in my life. And you watch these pastors, they'd be kind of baffled. Like, what does that have to do with anything? Well, because they want to deal with their things that have to do with their own experiences. They want to share. You probably also have that Bible study that has that guy that will never stop talking. Probably because, his wife is tired of listening to him, and he'll take it out on the Bible study. And you see this with any small group or any educational activity. If we take this assumption to heart, we've got to understand that we all have experiences. And I'll stop talking at you here real quick so you guys can share your own experiences, right? But we've got to pay attention to this. We've got to honor people's experience and give them a chance to share with each other. Is what their experience is always like accurate or helpful theologically? No, it isn't. And I've talked to many pastors who say, I don't want my people in Bible class just to share. I don't. Because someone's going to say something I don't know how to answer, or someone's going to share some misinformation, and that's all that anyone's going to remember is that piece of misinformation. And so they never have people share. And so you'll have a church with 1,000 members and 20 people in Bible study, and that's all who ever show up, because no one just wants to be talked at nonstop. Mind you, as I'm talking at you. Okay, number 6, orientation to learning. And here's the 6th assumption here, that adult learners are motivated to learn to the extent they'll perceive that learning will help them perform tasks or deal with problems they confront in their life situations. It's a time orientation. You are here at Best Practices going to this session right now probably because you have an issue or something with adult education that you want some tips with, right? That's something you can use. Something you can use when you go back. That's probably why you're here. That's how a lot of adults are. They want something they can use now. So you might find in like a Bible study or a Bible class or something, a person will show up out of nowhere. If you're like teaching a Bible class or small group, out of nowhere and show up, and you don't know why they're there. But the chances are, if they're coming out of the blue, it's because they have a particular problem in their life, and they think that this might be a place where they can learn to help with that problem. I did youth ministry for 8 years, and you have like these youth group kids come, out of nowhere. Never show up to church, never, but they come to youth group for the first time in forever, and you say, what's going on? You talk with them, and I got a friend at school who asked me why I'm a Christian. I don't know how to answer. So they're coming, and they have a real-life problem they need solved. And how do we pay attention to that? We can't always solve everyone's problems, but how do we pay attention to those things? I've given you a whole lot of rundown here, and that's a lot of talking at you. If you flip your sheet over, you have contrasting pedagogy and andragogy. These are some basic summaries. If you have your sheet here, there's some extra in the back. I think everyone should be able to have one. Here's my challenge to you. I want everyone independently, I'll give you just a couple minutes to take a look at this sheet, read it. I've got it up here, but take a look at your sheet here. If you have a pen or a pencil, underline or circle any words or phrases that stick out to you about the contrast between pedagogy and andragogy, these two different assumptions, sets of assumptions. What are the things that stick out to you and why? And I'll give you just a moment here to read through this and do this on your own. But before we start talking about what sticks out to you and what you've experienced and what seems to resonate with you right now. So give you a second to do that. And again, just to emphasize, this is a summary of the philosophy. You don't have to agree with everything, but I think it's something that's valuable to at least consider. Just think about how you approach teaching adults. Okay, I want everyone to think of one or two things that you circled, or a word or phrase or something that stuck out to you. One or two things that you'd be willing to share, and turn back to the groups you were in before. Groups of 2, 3, or 4, and give everyone a chance to share one or two of those things that stuck out to you as you process these two different sets of assumptions about learners. All right? Give you a chance, go for it. Share a thing or two.
Under the first, I underlined something versus external. Just in the challenge, kids learn something, what can I say, why do you want to under readiness,
But they're the same thing. When I kind
and then versus triggered by so for my example, high schoolers, my kids have passed that. And then in my volunteer work, I talk for dogs. I'm on a high school campus with special needs kids that are one nature is away from spending their life as people.
sort things out, and one of the principal things that happens. 90-some-year-old lady, and I think bring up the subject. They call my own stuff against us, so I treat that. Is it better to make your own decisions? When I need to praying that sort of thing. Which sort of thing to go from what might be the more way that I've been
No one I want to do nursing.
Then once you get to the student stage, then you don't, you shouldn't, I would shut down.
Well, for me, it was, I was to do this because I had to do it, you know, on fair. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of, you know, not that I go to things, you know, and I don't know them person, you know, I'm not saying that others are no, I understand why I react that way. And I think that's what we want to do. I don't know. I understand.
They always had canned hands on, you know, like, if they ask a question, you know, you know, like, they don't know how to show you the life. And by and large, shocked
I don't care about whether you're strawberry or and I was sickened by it because show up after theory class and the class was like, and I was doing, you know, drive to learn. Once for that, I know it's like everybody's
The funny thing is that
I'm not
it's more of my every Sunday.
All right. We'll have a little more chance to talk about specific context. I appreciate you guys talking. Yeah. We don't need to be in a rush, but, and again, I love these kinds of things with adult learners. They can just ask 2 questions and then just leave. And you guys can talk about it. And what I hear you guys saying is not just sharing random anecdotes, but actually now sharing your lives and your experiences. And we'll get a chance for the last bit to actually start to think about your particular context, because I'm hearing different contexts. And, you know, kind of do some cross-pollination on how we might be able to use these assumptions in your particular context. But what are some things that you heard? What are some things, common themes that you talked about in this contrasting and comparing and contrasting? Because I think this is important to kind of wrap your head around this theory. Yeah?
The focus seems to shift, whereas, like for kids, it's always very far in the future, or at least somewhat in the future, and it's acceptable to tell a kid, you're learning this so you can learn something else.
Right.
Or you'll need to know this later.
Right. It's progressive.
And for an adult, it's, I'm not waiting for this to become useful. I want this to be useful this afternoon.
Right, and that's one of the issues we run into in, say, like adult parish education or just adult education in general is when you think of school, and the only thing you think of school is, I'm going to sit through this thing that someone's telling me I need to learn that I'll use later. I say, come to Bible class. I'm not going to go to a Bible class because that's what they're thinking. It's school, right? I want something I can use now. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's because we were lied to when we were kids. A bunch of stuff we learned we never.
I mean, you probably have. We all kind of bear the scars a little of that, you know.
Never going to have a calculator.
I just said that.
You're going to have one math.
Right, and that's always the thing. Oh, you got to learn math, you know, that kind of thing. And there's a lot that we did learn as kids in math. Like if you can have multiplication tables in your head, you can do things a lot quicker. And other things, it feels like you've definitely been lied to. Right. So there's a certain amount of mistrust about the authority figure in front. Yeah.
But it's also that often the authority figure still treats this as a pedagogy rather than the andragogy.
Right.
And is assuming that even if the student has life experiences and might have some good input,
well, no, I'm the one who determines that, and you cannot in any way, shape, or form vary from that. It might not be an adult education, but I have seen it in
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And as you will probably tell in a lot of this andragogical way of thinking, this is just part of the theory, is that in order to be able to use these kinds of ideas, you need to really be paying attention to what the people know, and you got to be asking, right? What's your level at? What's your learning level at? You can't assume that everyone's at the same spot. What do you actually want to know? Like I said, when I did this with pastors, I just kind of talked about this with a handful of pastors and saw what kind of impact this had on their Bible classes. And that this great pastor, I mean, well-loved, well-respected, he kind of had this light bulb moment when I was doing this, and he said, you know what? I've never asked my Bible study people why they're here. Right? I mean, it's kind of shocking, but you go into any adult class, you'd be like, okay, you're choosing to be here, why are you here? And actually get that data. And not just like anecdotal data, right? You might get annoyed that I keep on asking you guys to go back into groups and things like that, but I'll find way too often we rely almost entirely on the most vocal person in the room for our feedback. There are 27 people in here, 27 different experiences, 27 different... But if I only ask big questions and only get one answer, that's like I'm playing football with one person, right? And everyone else immediately can just check out. So pay attention to what people actually, know and want to be able to do. Yeah?
So with all of this, is adult education, does it almost push itself, does it insist on smaller settings? Because what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that there's so much more flux with adult education. You have to respond to so many contextual pieces. Because I can teach 20 kids and more or less put them on the same page. There's diversity there, but you can force them onto the same page. Because
they don't have a choice.
There's no way they're on the same page.
Right. Yeah, and with kids, they don't really have a choice, do they? Yeah. Generally speaking, according to this theory, adult education tends to work better in smaller groups, right? And if you think about your own life, if you have a particular problem, right, you're going to talk to people who have other particular problems, right? And you're going to work on it. Yeah?
Well, I was going to say what you're doing here, though, is you're taking a large group and making it smaller.
Well, I'm trying, all right? I'm trying, but that's part of the hope, right? You get people talking and sharing. At least everyone's kind of engaged, even if you're not always enjoying this buddy up and talk. That's not everyone's favorite. You got to be careful about how you use it. But I'm assuming in this group, everyone's here because they want to learn something, and they're more or less willing to share. Any other thoughts that came up in this discussion? Huh?
I think there's an interesting chain. There's a benefit to talking to Lutherans, by and large, because they are more knowledgeable about what the Bible says and what's in the small catechism and a number of other things that are their past. But at the same time, I think they are curious of what more is there. And at least in my approach to Bible study and other things, it's great to know what the Bible says in the context and the history and the this and that, the facts. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more interesting to most people, whether they're middle-aged, old, or whatever, to sort of say, well, so what? What
Yeah.
does this mean to us today? Or I've often got into discussions on marriage or divorce based on the Bible, and really wonderful discussions. There's not a pat answer, but at least you're meeting the needs of the people to say, so why am I here, or what can I take away from this?
Yeah, go for it.
There's a difference between having the knowledge so that you can play Jeopardy, or having the knowledge so you can go on Survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. Different thing. And generally speaking, the adult life is Survivor, right? Right. It's a fight. I like that.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah, I'm stealing that. We're all stealing that. Okay. But that's important. You can come with all the things you think they want to know and learn, and you can be completely derailed because they have their own issues in life. So how do you pay attention to that? Honor that, without completely derailing the content, because content is important for them to know too. Yeah. Huh?
One question, would you actually want to talk to the adults and say, what do you want to know? What classes would you want to have?
Yep. I'd highly, highly recommend in a parish situation, in a setting, do some ongoing qualitative research. And all it has to be, what do you want to learn and why? Right? Why are you here? What do you want to learn and why? And that does not mean, please don't hear me out, that you got to give up going through a book of the Bible in a Bible study. Actually, in many cases, adults really love that because they haven't really been in the Word much, right? And abandon it all for self-help classes. We don't want to do that. We're people of the Word, right? The Word is the source of everything. The Spirit uses the Word to create and sustain faith. But when you know why they're there and what they want to learn, man alive, it will become very apparent to you as you go through as a teacher of the faith or in any sort of education. It'll become very apparent as you go through what to focus on. But unless you ask, you'll never know, and you'll just assume. And they'll think of themselves oftentimes just as students.
You might mention Noel's idea of a contract between the learner and the...
Yeah. Malcolm Knowles, a learning contract. The idea that it's a contract, right? They're there because they have something. They're there for a reason. You're here for a reason. I'm here for a reason. Let's negotiate. That's what a contract is. So think about whatever adult group you're with. Negotiate a kind of contract. You're still the expert. You don't have to give up control. But I'm going to negotiate the kinds of things you want to know, be able to do, and use that. And you'll find people will be much more invested. So thank you. Yeah.
But that's basically what I think you're saying.
Yeah.
You need to know that.
Yeah. Very cool. A couple of things. You guys have been really great. There are limitations to andragogy and Lutheran doctrine. One of the things that we always struggle with in practical theology is trying to faithfully integrate God's truth with a practice. That's practical theology, and it's always kind of cross-disciplinary, and it's always complicated. Andragogy tends to focus an awful lot on the individual and individual needs, and we who are Christians are called not to love and serve ourselves, but to have our identity focused more on Christ and our calling more on our neighbor. Okay, so we can't just throw everything out. We want to develop that. But one of the things I found as I was going through the research for my dissertation, among others, and I did pass this by a number of theologians as well, that many of these assumptions dovetail with things that we at least say we believe are important in our Lutheran understanding, that we don't always honor. We want mature disciples who abide in God's Word in a variety of ways throughout life. That's what we want to cultivate. My next session coming up in a little bit is going to be about that. Like, how do we focus on that? We want individuals to take responsibility for meditating on God's Word. We want them to understand that they are part of the priesthood of all believers. That's the book of Hebrews, right? You can go to the Father in prayer through Jesus Christ individually, and He will hear you. This is not dependent on the pastor. I'm writing a summary of the Book of Concord for Concordia Publishing House right now. And it was really interesting going through the summary of the Book of Concord. How many times over and over and over again? It's like, no, we want individuals to be able to go to the Lord in prayer. We want them to not think about their works, but we want them to understand who they are in Jesus Christ. We want them to love and serve their neighbor. And then I think of things like Martin Luther that kind of essentially started the idea of modern education for all people, so it's not just the rich who know how to read, but all know how to read. Why? So they could read the Word of God on their own and meditate on God's Word on their own. So these are things that are very near and dear to us, at least in theory as Lutherans. Shouldn't we in our adult education be working to move people from being dependent learners towards more independent learners and empower them with these things? And the same goes for a role of experience, readiness to learn, and orientation to learning. The idea of vocation and the two kinds of righteousness, passive righteousness and active righteousness, we want to help equip and encourage people to live out their daily lives. So why not say, what are the things that are motivating to you? Right? Why are you here? What do you want to learn? And help them understand how to deal with that in their daily life and how we're focusing on adult education. So these are things that we at least give lip service to as Lutherans, but I think because we teach the way we were taught, and most of us really haven't really thought about adult education all that much, or the last time we were in adult education was in a formal setting, like a college, right? Where they give out grades and it's not voluntary in the same kind of way. we teach the way we're taught that way. So I know that there are some things that are part of our Lutheran tradition that really dovetail with this very well. And just a kind of a thought also as we think about our role as adult educators, that if we educate and equip our adult disciples to faithfully engage their vocations, everything else we do in Christian education will either be easier or unnecessary. I'll think about that for a second. This is just Pete here. It's kind of a convoluted sentence.
Are you talking about vocatio, which includes more than your job vocation, or are you talking about your job?
Yeah, vocations. So all the different roles and responsibilities God has given you in your lives. The reality is that Jesus taught adults and blessed children. And we unfortunately get that turned around sometimes, where we only teach the children and we bless adults. Right? Go in peace. You don't need to learn anything. We'll do the kids' stuff. And so the idea, if we focus on adult education, then everything else we do in parish education for youth and children and schools and everything like that will be easier as more adults take their roles and responsibilities in life as heads of the household and in other ways more seriously. Okay? So it's just a thought. Okay. So applying this, the 6 assumptions, we're going to have this little bit here. I do not want to take you all the way to the end, right? But I do want you to think about your own positions, your own spots, your own ministries in life, the different places that God has placed you in adult education, and think about how you might be able to use these 6 assumptions, particularly in your context. So here's what I want you to do. I want everyone to think about a particular setting. A particular setting where you are either involved in or leading adults. Just think of one specific context. Okay? And you don't have to say it out loud, but think of where you're either a participant or a leader. Okay? And keep that in mind and flip this over. So you're going to do a little thought and reflection. We're going to break this up into 2 different sections here, so to not prolong things, because you have been sitting in conference settings a lot for the last few days. I'm going to give you a few minutes for each. Now, if you're a writer, I challenge you to write things down. If you're not a writer and you don't feel like writing anything down, you can sit and think and ponder. But there is a lot of educational research out there that says if you ask a question, you give people a chance to jot down some notes, even if it's a couple words, that really helps with processing. People of all ages. So I challenge you to do that. Okay? So thinking of your particular context, I'm going to go through these slides here. Okay? I'll go through a few at a time and give you like a minute or so just to kind of think about this. For each one of these assumptions, I want you to just think, what's your experience with this assumption in adult parish education? And it could be whatever context you're talking about here, but I'm thinking adult parish education. Right? What's your experience with this? Has it worked or not? Okay. And then how might this assumption, and here's the big question I want for each one, how might this assumption influence how you'll approach teaching adults or learning as an adult in your setting? So think about how this would help, how you could use this assumption in that context, right? How it might influence how you approach teaching in your setting. So with that in mind, I'm just going to go through this. I'm going to tell you when to switch between, but we're going to start with the first one, need to know. Okay? So that's question number 1 there. I'll give you a minute or so. I'm even going to just time it here so it doesn't take too long because I want to honor your guys' time. Take a minute here and say, okay, jot down any thoughts. What's your experience with this assumption that adult learners need to know what they need to learn before undertaking to learn it? And how might this impact learning or leading in your context? And I'll give you a minute here just to think about this. All right, to keep things moving, let's move on to the second one here, motivation to learn. And the assumption is that adult learners are responsive to some external motivators, but the most potent ones are internal pressures. How might that impact your teaching or your learning in an adult setting? What experiences have you had with that? All right, now onto the self-concept. Move on to the third one here. And the concept is that adult learners have a self-concept of being responsible for their own decisions, for their own lives. How might you use this in your context? How it might impact your teaching or learning? I know we're going pretty quick here, but it's also hot. What did you think? Okay. Now, I want you to think of like one or two things you came up with, right, for these assumptions and how you might be able to use that. Let's turn back to our groups. I'm going to give you just a couple minutes. Share one or two things. Don't get too hung up on, sharing one particular person, which that's easy to do as you start sharing. But come up with the ideas you came up with and see what you had similar and different. All right? Let everyone share one or two things that you were thinking of about using these assumptions. Go for it.
But there's a lot of ideas
What about what that means feel about yourself? What is that about? We have to understand the values. Let people start to get a better feeling of where they are. Embarrassed about kind of curious about
I like the ask, and I think it
I just focus learning and from their motivation.
You might have just said it, in the
But it goes back to like how
don't make it about more to learn, that's not motivated. You might identify that they have something to offer us, and they weren't even thinking about that.
You guys are done. That's it. You just have that look, just kind of glazed over. All of us.
I had a situation where I was cleaning up a system with a mom.
All right. And again, I don't desire to cut off all these amazing conversations, but everyone's tired, and it's hot. So for one last time here, I'll give you just a few minutes. We're going to go through a few more of these assumptions. And I know this sounds repetitive, but hopefully you're just gathering some thoughts, gathering some ideas for yourself or from other people that you might be able to use. And so we're going to do this one more time. We've got 3 more assumptions, 4 through 6, the readiness to learn, role of experience, and orientation to learning. Let's do the same thing. Now, based on what you've heard, what you were talking about, take a couple minutes here and just go through these. So readiness to learn. Let's think. How might this assumption that adult learners become ready to learn those things they need to know in order to be able to and do in order to cope effectively with real life situations, how might this be usable to you in your context? How might this impact your learning if you focus on this assumption? All right, moving on to role of experience. Just some thoughts. Again, just write down some sentence fragments or whatever, but just thoughts that adult learners come into an educational activity with both a greater volume and a different quality of experience from that of youths. How might focusing on this impact your setting? Give me a second just to reflect on this. All right, and final one, you guys are doing great. Orientation to learning. And the assumption is that adult learners are motivated to learn to the extent that they'll perceive that learning will help them perform tasks or deal with problems that they confront in their life situations. How might focusing on this impact your teaching in your setting? All right, you guys have been sitting here in the heat, writing and thinking for a while. Let's just turn back to your groups one more time for a little bit here, and give people who didn't really get a chance to talk before a chance to talk if they haven't yet. And share a couple things that you came up with that might be useful for you in your setting. Then you guys can go get water. Yeah, I know you guys.
Good stuff. A couple light bulbs really went off.
Okay.
I've got a 17-year-old daughter who went from 3.8 GPA sophomore to I'm not graduating high school in pandemic. Went from being a child learner to an adult learner. And everything was ripped away, right?
Right.
No people to report to except somebody online.
Now you're out for yourself.
It just absolutely got dismantled. And and there were other influences.
Sure.
Plenty of stuff happening in the real world, but to think about this as, well, I went from child learning to adult learning, just it's a lot like the collapse of a freshman student in college.
Oh, sure.
Right? I mean,
Just disappeared.
It's just weird that happened under the roof, and while we were trying to pay attention to it and helping her through it, just there's no motivation. Because a lot of the stuff that we see, this is
But and when you don't have that like a forced sitting down.
Sure.
But why am I going to learn this?
Right. And anyway, it was just a real light bulb moment for me. I'm just noticing that's one piece to notice.
Interesting. Well, I hope some of this might.
Yeah, it'll stimulate some thought.
Some thought, but anyway.
Some helpful.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, adults have more opportunity to suffer because of the word.
Because no one can fill their weight. People sharing experience.
Why?
Well,
Emphasize what it is.
Get the shot.
I had a question that said, if you have kids in the congregation, would it be possible to pay them
Not what I can imagine in my
Charge of the life away, where you gotta memorize that.
I've always been interested in that.
But we can't
My kids are pretty shy.
Where you are.
What was your impression?
Okay.
That hadn't been the case. But when you heard the lines,
Well, some people are still talking. Some people are done. Hopefully, you've got something out of this that you'll be able to take with you back to where you are. That's my email. That's my work phone number. Even though I work at Concordia Publishing House, I am very open to conversations, ongoing discussions. If you have anything, questions about what we do at CPH or just about adult learning, I'll at least throw you what I know. I'm not the expert in all things, but hopefully we've got some ideas out of this that you can use. If you want to keep talking, go for it. There's no class in here for another 45 minutes. If you want to go, like some people already have, and need to get a drink or use the bathroom, go for it. Thanks for the opportunity, and blessings on your ministry, guys.
Thank you so much.